In the shadows of the Middle Ages, a chilling array of torture devices loomed large in the public imagination. Often depicted as instruments of brutal punishment, many of these devices were rarely used, serving instead as tools of fear and control. Their very presence was enough to instill dread, creating an atmosphere where compliance was often obtained without the need for bloodshed. But why were these notorious devices seldom employed in practice? The popular narrative suggests that medieval society was steeped in violence, where torture was a routine spectacle. Yet historical records reveal a more complex reality. Many devices, such as the infamous breaking wheel or the Judas cradle, were seldom implemented. Instead, they thrived as symbols of authority, designed to evoke fear rather than to inflict pain. This raises a critical question. What was the true purpose behind their design? To understand the role of these devices, we must delve into the societal structures of the time. In a world where centralized law enforcement was virtually non-existent, the threat of punishment was paramount. Torture devices were strategically placed in public spaces, serving as grim reminders of the consequences of defiance. The fear they inspired was often more effective than any actual violence could ever be. The psychological impact of torture devices was profound. They were not merely instruments of pain, but rather tools of social control. The mere sight of a gallows or a pillory could deter potential offenders, reinforcing the power of the ruling class. This dynamic created a society where fear reigned, and obedience was often a matter of survival. But how did this reliance on fear shape the lives of ordinary people? As we explore this landscape of terror, we encounter the figure of Thomas, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and deep-set brown eyes. His once vibrant auburn hair is now streaked with gray, reflecting the toll of living under the constant threat of punishment. Thomas, like many, has learned to navigate this world of fear, where the mere mention of torture devices can silence dissent and ensure compliance. In this environment, the line between justice and cruelty blurred. The threat of torture was often enough to extract confessions or compliance, rendering the devices themselves almost superfluous. This manipulation of fear created a fragile social order, where the specter of punishment loomed larger than the act itself. But what happens when the fear begins to fade? The legacy of these devices is steeped in contradiction. While they were designed to instill terror, their actual use was often limited. This paradox invites us to reconsider the narratives that have shaped our understanding of medieval justice. If these instruments of fear were rarely employed, what does that say about the societies that wielded them? How did they maintain control without resorting to constant violence? As we peel back the layers of history, we uncover a truth that challenges our assumptions. The devices that have become synonymous with medieval cruelty were often more about intimidation than execution. This revelation leads us to a pivotal question. If fear was the primary tool for maintaining order, how did this shape the lives of those who lived under its shadow? The enigma of medieval torture devices lies not in their brutality, but in their purpose. As we embark on this journey through history, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that the most effective systems of control often rely on fear rather than violence. This begs the question, what does this mean for our understanding of justice, power, and human nature in a world shaped by terror? In the absence of modern law enforcement, medieval societies relied on public displays of punishment to maintain order. Fear became the primary tool for compliance, shaping a fragile social structure where authority was upheld through intimidation rather than force. Without police, communities enforced their own laws. Public punishments were staged to serve as warnings to others. The spectacle of suffering was a grim reminder of the consequences of defiance, reinforcing the power of local leaders and their reputations. The threat of torture devices loomed large in the minds of the populace. Instruments like the rack and iron maiden, though rarely used, were symbols of a justice system that relied on fear. Their mere presence was often enough to quell dissent. Judges and local leaders wielded this fear as a means of control. The threat of punishment became a psychological weapon, ensuring compliance without the need for constant surveillance or enforcement. Reputation was everything in these communities. Public executions and punishments were not only about justice, They were performances designed to instill fear. The crowd's reaction was a vital part of the spectacle, as fear spread through whispers and gasps, reinforcing the power of the ruling class. Communities often enacted their own forms of justice, with neighbors watching each other closely. The fear of being publicly punished created a sense of collective responsibility, where individuals were compelled to conform to societal norms. Rumors and tales of punishment circulated widely, often exaggerated. These stories served to enhance the fear factor, making the threat of punishment feel ever present, even if the actual devices were seldom used. This reliance on fear as law enforcement created a precarious balance. While it maintained order, it also sowed seeds of distrust among neighbors, as people were pitted against one another in a struggle for survival and compliance. As these systems of fear took root, they became ingrained in the fabric of society. The question remained, how long could such a fragile order endure before the very fear that upheld it began to unravel? Throughout the centuries, the narrative of the Middle Ages transformed, shaped by the pens of Enlightenment thinkers and Victorian writers. They painted a picture of barbarism, amplifying tales of cruelty to highlight their own perceived civility. This distortion created a mythos around medieval life, where torture devices became symbols of a dark age rather than tools of occasional punishment. Victorian fascination with the macabre led to the creation of elaborate displays in museums, showcasing devices like the Iron Maiden and the rack. These exhibits often lacked historical accuracy, focusing instead on sensationalism. Such portrayals captivated the public imagination, reinforcing the belief that medieval society was defined by its brutality rather than its complexities. Historians of the time, eager to contrast their enlightened age with the supposed savagery of the past, contributed to this narrative. They often relied on exaggerated accounts and anecdotal evidence, presenting a skewed view of medieval justice. The result was a historical myth that overshadowed the reality of a society governed by fear and reputation. As the 19th century progressed, the myth of medieval torture became intertwined with the rise of Gothic literature. Authors like Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley drew inspiration from these exaggerated tales, further embedding the notion of a cruel and barbaric past into popular culture. Their works perpetuated the fear of the Middle Ages, creating a lasting legacy of horror. The influence of these narratives extended beyond literature into the realm of art. Painters and illustrators depicted scenes of torture and suffering, often prioritizing shock value over historical accuracy. These images became iconic representations of the Middle Ages, reinforcing a collective memory steeped in violence and despair. As the 20th century dawned, the fascination with medieval torture devices persisted, fueled by films and media that sensationalized the past. The horror genre thrived on these myths, often depicting the Middle Ages as a time of unrelenting cruelty. This portrayal overshadowed the more nuanced aspects of medieval justice and governance. The rise of historical fiction further entrenched these myths, as authors crafted narratives filled with graphic depictions of torture. While some sought to educate, many prioritized entertainment, reinforcing the stereotype of the Middle Ages as a barbaric epoch. This blurred the lines between fact and fiction, complicating our understanding of history. Despite the inaccuracies, the myth of medieval torture devices continues to captivate modern audiences. Museums still display these artifacts, often emphasizing their gruesome reputations rather than their historical context. This ongoing fascination reveals a deeper societal need to confront our fears through the lens of history. As we delve deeper into the reality of these devices, it becomes clear that the myth and the truth diverge significantly. Understanding the true purpose behind these tools reveals a complex relationship between fear and authority, setting the stage for the next chapter in our exploration of medieval justice. In medieval towns, the pillory stood as a stark reminder of societal norms. This wooden structure, with its holes for the head and hands, served to publicly shame those who transgressed. The punishment inflicted was not physical pain, but rather the scorn of the crowd, a far more potent weapon in maintaining order. Stocks, too, were instruments of humiliation. Often placed in the marketplace, They held the accused in a position of vulnerability. Passers-by would hurl insults and rotten vegetables, reinforcing the idea that social disgrace could be more damaging than any physical punishment. The fear of economic ruin loomed large. A merchant caught cheating could find himself in the stocks, his reputation tarnished, and business ruined. The loss of social standing often led to a more profound suffering than any inflicted wounds. In some cases, public humiliation was a community affair. The pillory became a stage for local gossip, where the audience derived entertainment from the misfortunes of others. This spectacle reinforced social cohesion through shared condemnation. Women, too, faced unique forms of public humiliation. The ducking stool was used to punish those accused of witchcraft or gossiping. The act of submerging a woman in water was less about punishment and more about reinforcing societal norms of behavior. The medieval mindset viewed shame as a powerful deterrent. A person's reputation could be irrevocably damaged by a single public display of punishment. The fear of social ostracism often kept individuals in line far more effectively than the threat of physical harm. In this world, the threat of punishment was often enough to ensure compliance. The mere presence of stocks or pillories could deter potential wrongdoers. The psychological impact of these devices was profound, instilling fear without the need for frequent use. As communities evolved, the reliance on public humiliation began to shift. The changing perceptions of justice and morality sparked debates about the effectiveness of these devices. Were they truly serving their intended purpose, or were they relics of a bygone era? The legacy of these devices reminds us that the line between punishment and performance is often blurred. The next chapter in our exploration will uncover how the very existence of these instruments shaped the legal systems that followed. In the dim light of a medieval courtroom, judges often relied on the mere presence of torture devices to extract confessions. The threat of pain loomed larger than the act itself, creating an atmosphere thick with fear and anticipation. Interrogation practices were steeped in ritual. Judges, often older men with weathered faces and piercing eyes, would employ psychological tactics, weaving a narrative of inevitability that left the accused feeling trapped and hopeless. The accused, often trembling and disheveled, faced not only the threat of physical torture, but also the weight of societal judgment. Their fate hung precariously on the confessions extracted under duress, amplifying the stakes of their words. Rituals of confession often involved public displays where the accused would be paraded in front of a crowd. This act served to reinforce the power of the court and the pervasive fear of punishment that governed society. The psychological pressure exerted by judges was often more effective than physical pain. The mere suggestion of torture could lead to confessions, as individuals sought to escape the impending dread of what might come next. Confessions were often seen as a form of performance, where the accused played their part in a grim theater of justice. The courtroom became a stage, and the stakes were their very lives. Judges understood that the threat of torture was a powerful tool. It created an atmosphere where compliance was not just expected, it was inevitable. The fear of the unknown loomed larger than any punishment. As the accused faced their fate, the courtroom became a crucible of fear and despair. The psychological toll of the proceedings often left lasting scars far deeper than any physical wounds could inflict. In this theater of justice, the line between truth and coercion blurred. The power of confession, extracted under duress, shaped the very fabric of medieval law, leaving a legacy that would echo through the ages. During the height of the Inquisition, torture devices transformed into symbols of divine authority. The Church wielded these instruments not merely for punishment, but as manifestations of spiritual judgment, instilling fear in the hearts of the faithful. As the Inquisitors entered towns, their presence was marked by the ominous sight of these devices. They served as a reminder that defiance against the Church could lead to eternal damnation, a fate far worse than physical pain. The psychological weight of these symbols was profound. Believers were taught that the Church acted with divine authority, and the threat of torture reinforced the notion that resistance was futile, binding them to their faith. Torture devices like the Iron Maiden and the Brazen Bull, though rarely used, became powerful icons of the church's reach. They represented the ultimate consequence of heresy, reinforcing the belief that spiritual and earthly realms were intertwined. Inquisitors often relied on the mere presence of these devices to extract confessions. The thought of eternal punishment loomed larger than the devices themselves, making the threat of torture a tool of compliance. The intertwining of faith and fear was evident in public spectacles. Crowds gathered to witness the display of authority, reinforcing the idea that the church's judgment was absolute and unyielding. For many, the sight of these devices became a part of daily life, a constant reminder of the consequences of straying from the church's teachings. The threat was ever present, shaping societal norms and behaviors. As the Inquisition continued, the devices evolved into more than just tools of torture. They became emblems of the church's power, a chilling reminder that faith could be enforced through fear. The legacy of these symbols persisted, shaping the relationship between the church and its followers. The intertwining of fear and faith would have lasting implications, echoing through the ages as society grappled with authority. In medieval towns, public punishments drew large crowds, transforming fear into a collective experience. The sight of a condemned person facing the gallows was not merely a spectacle. It was a warning to all present about the consequences of disobedience. Witnesses played a crucial role in amplifying the impact of punishments. As people shared their experiences, the stories morphed into cautionary tales, spreading fear throughout the community, ensuring that the threat of punishment lingered long after the event. The act of witnessing punishment became a ritual in itself. People traveled from neighboring villages to observe, knowing that the more eyes on the punishment, the stronger the message of deterrence. Fear was not just personal, it was communal. In towns like York and Paris, public executions were events that drew hundreds. The anticipation of the crowd heightened the tension, as the condemned were paraded before them, their fates sealed by the collective gaze of society. The power of the crowd was palpable. Their reactions could sway the outcome of a punishment. A sympathetic murmur could lead to a lighter sentence, while jeers could intensify the severity, demonstrating the crowd's influence over justice. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by the stories of those who witnessed the punishments. Over time, these tales took on a life of their own, distorting the truth and amplifying the fear that kept communities in line. As the years wore on, the reliance on public punishment began to shift. The initial shock value diminished, and the crowd's role evolved from passive observers to active participants in the narrative of justice. Despite the changes, the legacy of these public spectacles endured. Communities remained bound by the shared memory of fear, and the stories of those punished continued to echo through generations. As the medieval era drew to a close, the dynamics of fear and punishment were beginning to shift. The crowd's influence would soon face challenges, setting the stage for a new understanding of justice and authority. As the 15th century unfolded, public executions began to lose their grip on the collective psyche. The once dreaded spectacle of punishment transformed into a source of unease, as crowds grew increasingly sympathetic to the accused, questioning the authority behind the acts. Witnesses began to doubt the legitimacy of confessions obtained through torture. The fear that once permeated the air now mingled with skepticism, as people recognized the fragility of justice in a system that relied on intimidation rather than truth. By the late 1400s, the rise of humanism encouraged a shift in thought. Scholars began to advocate for more humane treatment of the accused, viewing torture as not only ineffective but also morally repugnant, leading to a gradual decline in its acceptance. As legal systems evolved, the reliance on public punishment diminished. Increasingly, authorities recognized that a society built on fear was unstable, and the once feared devices of torture were now seen as relics of a barbaric past. The shift in public perception was palpable. As crowds began to resist the spectacle of punishment, the power of the torturer diminished. Fear transformed into empathy, creating a new dynamic between the accused and the onlookers. In this changing landscape, the once terrifying devices became symbols of outdated authority. The fear they once instilled was replaced by a growing demand for justice based on reason, compassion, and an understanding of human rights. The decline of public executions also marked a significant cultural shift. As communities began to question the morality of such practices, the narratives surrounding justice and punishment evolved, paving the way for a more humane approach. Despite this transformation, the legacy of torture devices lingered in the minds of the people. The stories of those who suffered at their hands became cautionary tales, reminding society of the darker aspects of human nature. As the 16th century approached, the tension between tradition and progress grew. The remnants of fear still echoed in the hearts of many, hinting at the complexities of human behavior and the enduring impact of authority. The legacy of medieval torture devices endures, not merely as relics of cruelty, but as symbols of societal control. They remind us that fear, rather than violence, was the true weapon of authority in those times. In films and literature, these devices are often sensationalized, overshadowing their intended purpose. They evoke a primal fear that resonates with modern audiences, reinforcing the notion that terror can govern behavior. The fascination with medieval torture reflects a deeper discomfort within society. It serves as a mirror, revealing our ongoing struggles with authority, punishment, and the lengths to which we will go to maintain control. As we explore these devices, we confront the darker aspects of human nature. They remind us that the most effective systems of oppression rely on the manipulation of fear, belief, and the threat of violence. Today, museums strive to educate rather than sensationalize. They aim to contextualize these devices within their historical framework, emphasizing the societal structures that enabled such practices. Yet despite efforts to demystify, the allure of horror remains potent. The stories of suffering and punishment linger in our collective consciousness, shaping how we view justice and morality. In reflecting on the past, we must also consider how these lessons apply today. The mechanisms of control may have evolved, but the underlying principles of fear and compliance persist. Ultimately, the legacy of medieval torture devices serves as a cautionary tale. It challenges us to confront the ways we wield power and the impact of fear on our shared humanity.